Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the DevOps Playground. Thank you to those of you who have joined us here in the Edinburgh office. We also have watch parties in our London office and our Manchester office, and of course we're live streaming the event tonight on YouTube. It's great to have you all here. We've been running these DevOps Playgrounds at Global Logic for 4 or 5 years now, and in the last couple of months we've managed to get back to in-person events and also streaming them live on YouTube as well. So it's great to have a mix of both after the lockdown of the pandemic and see people face to face and in real life. So welcome to you all. For those of you that are in the office, we will have runners helping you out as you code along with Simon tonight, who we'll introduce in a second. For those of you that are watching on YouTube, please put comments in YouTube or join the Slack channel, the details of which are in the invite. Simon's going to take us through AWS CodeCatalyst tonight, and it's a hands-on event, laptops out, and follow along and get an introduction to this tool. Simon's one of our principal consultants. He's part of our cloud team here at Global Logic. He's been with us for about 2 years. He's just back from reInvent a few months ago, where he ate a lot of cake, I believe. But so. Yeah.
The odd slice or two.
So without any further ado, I'll hand you over to Simon.
Thank you very much, Mark. Hello, everyone. Both in the office and online as well. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, as Mark said, we run these DevOps Playground sessions about every month. It's usually the last Thursday in the month, I believe. We cover a variety of projects, things to try out. So, as it says there, the idea behind these is it's not just me or whoever standing at the front and talking to you. We are going to try and get you to do hands-on stuff as well. So we're going to talk you through a workshop, show you how to do things, try it out, etc. We are going to talk tonight about Amazon CodeCatalyst. I'll take you through what CodeCatalyst is in a minute. We'll just do some kind of intro stuff in a minute. We'll take you through how it works, what we can do with it, kind of what Amazon's aims are, what they're hoping to achieve. But especially for anybody who's following along online or wants to try this later, we do have a GitHub repository. As we go through the workshop, we have set a space up for everybody to try out. We've already put the code from this repository there, so there is some example Python and Terraform code in there. We don't expect you to type the Python and stuff as we go. So feel free to follow along there. The steps in the workshop that I'm going to take you through are in there as well. There's a set of readmes in there. So there's a main readme that will kind of give you the agenda. And then we're going to do 4 steps to the workshop as we go through. There's an individual readme for those as well. Hopefully they'll let you keep up with what we're doing. There's screenshots in there as well, so you can follow along. And as we said, if you wanted to try it out later on, welcome to come back and do that. So, Mark stole my thunder, really. My name's Simon Hanmer. LinkedIn profile on there, I won't go too much into that. Yeah, I work in the cloud team as part of the design and engineering capability. Basically, I work with our clients. We help build cloud, get people experienced, get them trained up, and really help the clients with whatever it is they need to do. As Mark mentioned, luckily enough, we had a group go out to AWS reInvent last November, December. I was lucky enough to be one of the people who went out. And one of the things that was announced at reInvent, you've probably seen the announcements, is a new service called Amazon CodeCatalyst. I'm just going to call this out. It is in preview, so it's not production ready. Please don't try and run any live workloads on this yet. But it's still an interesting space to look at. Because it's in preview, Amazon are really interested in any feedback that anybody can give. I'll mention later on, there's a space that you can use, kind of like a forum. I can say personally, they are very responsive in there. So a lot of the product team for CodeCatalyst are in there. They're answering the questions, so they want the feedback. They want to know what's working, what doesn't work, etc. But yeah, I'll just reiterate, it is preview. Don't try and run your real infrastructure on this. But jump in there, try it out. It is a very interesting space to work in. Okay. So, as I mentioned, CodeCatalyst was announced kind of the last day of reInvent. They have on the Thursday, the 4th day. All the big tech announcements tend to come out on that day. And the way that Amazon describe this, Amazon do this thing that they call undifferentiated heavy lifting. So what they try and do is look at the problems their clients have got, the customers that are using Amazon, find the things that everybody's doing, find the pain points, try and solve those problems. So you'll see some of the challenges that we're typically talking about with development on the screen there on the slide. So things like automating our workflows. How do we get our code out there? How do we get people working across multiple repositories? How can we get them to collaborate? Many of us are probably using things like Jira, Trello, all of those kind of things. And how do we integrate that? And one of the real problems that I've definitely seen is when we're working in these spaces, probably people have probably seen this, we work with a multitude of tools. You're probably doing things like GitHub, Bitbucket, you're working with Jenkins, TeamCity, all of these pipeline tools, Terraform Enterprise. They're all spread out. We've got to use different things to get to them. Probably using Jira and Confluence to manage our workspaces and documentation. So what Amazon said is we want to solve this. They have had a set of tools already, things like Code Pipeline, Code Deploy, but I think anybody who's touched those things would say they're not necessarily the easiest to use. They're great if you use the Amazon way of working, but not everybody works the Amazon way. So if you're working with multiple branches, it can be a bit more of a challenge to use things like Code Pipeline. So CodeCatalyst, one of the things it aims is to make life easier for everybody. And if you look on their webpage, they have this wonderful blurb. I'm not going to try and read that out. As it says, it's a collaboration space for development teams. It lets you plan your work, so tickets, Kanban boards, if people who use Scrum boards, those kind of things. We can build our code in IDEs, we can test it, we can deploy it, and we can use similar tools that we're all used to working with, but it's all in a single space rather than being spread out across multiple tools. So one thing we will mention as we're going through, this is a little bit new for Amazon. They've introduced this idea of builder IDs. So a builder ID it's tied more to us as individuals. So the way that Amazon sell this is, for example, I work with a lot of different clients. I'll move around, I'll work with different people. What builder IDs will let me do is keep that ID, but the clients can tie it into their directories. So I can still use my same login details, move it around, keep my code, the tool sets that I'm used to. Big arrow at the bottom there. There's no SSO integration yet. We know that most of the people that we work with, you log in with your Active Directory, your laptop credentials, that gets you into AWS. At the minute, that isn't there. It is on the road plan. They haven't said when they're going to bring it, but they did say at reInvent, they know that most enterprise clients especially are going to want to bring this in. So builder IDs give us access to CodeCatalyst. What we've done is we've set up some builder IDs for you. We'll share how to get in a minute. It also gives us access to other tools. There's a tool they have called Code Whisperer. Code Whisperer is kind of an AI tool. GitHub have a similar thing where you can kind of tell it the code that you want to deploy and it will make suggestions as you are coding how to do things. Code Whisperer can do something similar. Good old ChatGPT is obviously in the news as well. That's kind of doing similar stuff. The other thing that it gives us access to is, it's not exactly new, but it hasn't been greatly publicized. Amazon have this space called Repost, and it's one of these kind of community spaces. So any enterprise clients have probably got support, but as individual developers, it can be quite hard to reach out to people to ask questions. Yes, there are spaces like Slack, Reddit, all of those kind of things. But this is an AWS platform. It has forums, so you can ask questions around specific tools, but it also has knowledge articles, how to build things. It's kind of a one-stop shop for developers. That's what they're aiming at. And you can use your builder IDs there. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a very short walkthrough on the architecture of CodeCatalyst, how it works behind the scenes. If you like the high-level stuff, probably 5 minutes or so, and then we'll actually get into the workshop. So we're probably, a lot of us are used to working in spaces where we're working with multiple accounts, dev accounts, test accounts, lives, pre-prod, prod, all of those kind of things. CodeCatalyst itself sits in its own account. So it sits outside our development accounts. The spaces that we work with is managed, obviously. Amazon have put a lot of security around this, and the way that it works, we'll go through in a second, is we tie it to our working spaces, our real live accounts. Each CodeCatalyst account, it says 5 there, it's actually 10. You can have 10 spaces. And a space is, it lets you group projects. So as an example, you might be deploying a website that's going to have your web code. It's possibly going to have APIs. It's going to have CloudFormation, Terraform, CDKs, however you're deploying the infrastructure. Those might be sitting in different repositories, so they can all be grouped together in this space as a project. As it says, per CodeCatalyst, we get, it's actually 10 spaces by default in each CodeCatalyst account. And each project can have many, each space can have many projects. It's up to 10, up to 1,000. So hopefully there's enough space for most of us in there. The projects let us group together the things we need for development. So it lets us take those builder IDs. We give it permission to come into that different levels. So we can have administrators, we can have developers, we can set the permissions on those, they can do different things. We need somewhere to put our code. So CodeCatalyst comes with its own repositories. Those are tied to the project. You can also link into GitHub repositories at the minute. That's the only one that's there at the minute, but I guess the expectation is we're probably going to get GitLab, Bitbucket as well. So if you already have repositories, you don't have to import them. You can use the repositories you have within CodeCatalyst, and developers we normally would. We also get what AWS are calling dev environments. The idea behind dev environments is it's kind of a virtual desktop for our developers. So definitely one of the challenges that I see when I'm working with different clients is we often get a laptop or a working environment, and that's similar across everybody in the organization. So they'll all get a similar build, and they're usually tied down in some way. If it's a corporate laptop, you can't install tools, you can't get the libraries you need. The things that you need are never installed consistently, so you move between different teams. The workspace you've got suddenly stops working because you haven't got the tools you used to. So the idea behind dev environments is it gives you a virtual space to work in. These will tie into a cloud-based IDE. If anybody's used Cloud9, that's it. But you can also tie it into your IDEs you're working with already. So you can tie it into VS Code, into Jets. Other ones will come along, I'm sure, as well. So if you're ready to set up, you've got the extensions you like, you can carry on using those. And probably the last piece, or the most important piece, are the workflows. If you use Jenkins pipelines, it's basically how we define the jobs that we're going to do with the code as we make changes to the code. So doing unit tests, scanning for vulnerabilities, building out, deploying to your test environment, doing testing in those, then deploying through to production. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the idea is CodeCatalyst is in its own account. So what we can do in the workflows is we can connect them to our real AWS accounts where we do our work. There is an IAM role that you set up in CodeCatalyst, link into in your accounts. So you do have control over the permissions you're giving it. It's obviously going to be a concern for some people. My code sitting in an Amazon account, how do I know that's secure? The answer is you secure it with the IAM role. You tell it what that role can do in your account. And it will link to multiple accounts. We've just shown two here, Dev and Live, but you can have several connected. So it all works all fine. So that's kind of the architecture of CodeCatalyst. One of the things I mentioned at reInvent, and this is a really good way to try Catalyst out, is they have put together what they call blueprints. And blueprints are example projects, if you like, but it's things that we are probably used to using, spaces. So we've got things like an API in there, a RESTful microservice. It's the kind of tool space we're used to working in, 3-tier web applications, and some other examples. So you can, if you click on those, it will give you example code, it will give you example infrastructure, workflows, predefined workspaces. So rather than having to start from scratch, you can get a space that is probably representative of the kind of things that you're going to do. However, I'm going to keep it difficult today. We are going to ignore those. We're going to start from scratch and we are going to build. We're going to try building code, put that in workflows, try deploying to Amazon. We'll see how that goes. Important thing that people sometimes forget about is somebody has to pay for these at the end of the day. So the pricing is, there's a link at the top there. If you just Google CodeCatalyst pricing, you'll get through to that link fairly easily. You do get a free tier, as with a lot of AWS services. So you get things, as it says there, you'll get 2,000 minutes on your builds. You'll get 60 hours per month on your dev environments. So it's enough to get in there, try it out. And actually the pricing isn't too bad if you go for the standard tier compared to some of the tools like GitHub. Bitbucket is probably not that different. There are a lot more stuff you'll see. I didn't want to have a huge screenshot with tiny print on there. So go and have a look at the link and you'll get more details. So before I go on to the hands-on workshop, any questions around what CodeCatalyst is, kind of the aims, what they're trying to do with it?
There's a question
Okay.
on chat. Can it integrate with CodeStart and other developer tools? For example, code build, code deploy, code pipeline.
Strangely enough, that's what they're using under the covers. So if anybody who's used to AWS is probably used to the idea of ARNs, Amazon resources. If you look at things like when you've got a dev environment, if you look at the remote URL for the Git repository, it's pointing into code commit, sorry. I believe it uses code build behind the scenes for some of the actions as well. Can you integrate with it? You have access to all of the AWS APIs. So at the minute, there's no way through the UI, but if you're used to working with the APIs, you could definitely build those integrations in there.
I guess a follow-on question, can it integrate with Elastic Beanstalk? I imagine through the APIs as well?
Yeah, would be the short answer. Yes, so if you're using other tools other than CloudFormation, Terraform, so it definitely supports CDK. I've seen people doing that in examples, people using SAM. I would expect that the same way, because you can go all of the CLI commands, you can deploy, if you've got the code in repository, you could probably deploy that way. I can't say definitely, I'm not an expert on Beanstalk, but yeah. The other thing I would say is if you've got questions, pop them on repost. That space is there. The guys will come back and tell you. Not just Amazon, but other people are trying this out. There's a lot of people out there interested in it. Okay, any other questions? Good. If there are questions, obviously people in the room can shout out. People online, pop them in the chat and we'll pick those up. So, a hands-on session. We're going to look at how we log into a CodeCatalyst space. We're going to go through the tools that I've mentioned, things like the repositories, the dev environments. We're going to build a workflow using the sample code I talked about. And the aim is, if everything goes to plan, we'll actually deploy that into some AWS accounts and we'll try it out, we'll test it. So how do we get there? This is always the fun bit in the playground. We have a link, https://lab.devopsplayground.org. And I'll tell you what, let me stop the presentation there and I'll show you what this looks like. So give me a second. While I find my browser hiding away some here. Okay, so if you go, it's kind of small writing, I apologize. Let me make that a little larger, if I can. If you go to lab.devopsplayground.org, you'll see it's asking you for your Meetup username. So if you registered through Meetup, use the display name from there. So my name is Simon Hanmer in Meetup, for example. For the Global Logic people, if you just use first name, last name. Pop that in there. Please don't use my details because it won't mess the demo up, but it'll make it interesting later. What you'll get when you put your name in is some information. So you will get a login email. That's the builder ID. We've set these up in advance so you can use them. You'll see that mine has devopsplayground.gl plus funny panda for some reason in this case. You'll also see that we have a panda name at the bottom, funny panda for myself. You should all get unique names on there. And there is a URL to access CodeCatalyst. So I'll just give everybody, has everybody in the room managed to get those details? Okay. Okay. If anybody online is having problems, please shout out in the chat and one of the team will answer and they'll help you out, get you the details. So. Oops. I'll just say now, every time I try and do a demo with a keyboard live, my typing just goes out of the window. So I'll apologize. Okay, I'm already logged in, so let me just log out of there. So when you go to CodeCatalyst, if you just type CodeCatalyst AWS, it will bring you to this screen. There's documentation in here, there's the pricing stuff, all of that. But most importantly, up in the top corner, you have a sign-in. And you'll see here, this is where it talks about the builder IDs. So it's giving us the option to create a builder ID. As I say, we've already created those for you. Give me a second. It's clever enough if you put an ID in there, the ones that we've given you, even though it says create one, it knows that it's a builder's ID, so it will take you through to where it asks for the password. Doesn't pre-fill. I've got a password manager in my browser, so it doesn't remember that, don't worry. Okay, we will let CodeCatalyst come up. You'll get your first view of it. And I will just give everybody a minute in the room and hopefully online. As I say, if you have problems getting in, shout out. People in the room, we've got people who can help you. Same online as well. So what you can see at the top is we have a space called DevOps Playground, funnily enough, unique naming. As I said, my panda name is Funny Panda, so I can only see my project. So again, security-wise, there's something like 40 projects in here. Because I'm only a contributor, I can only see the projects I'm supposed to be working on. You can be assigned multiple projects at the same time, so you can access different ones. You can see from there, we are getting some links already. So we have some of the tools that CodeCatalyst provides, as you can see, source repositories. We talked about workflows, dev environments. We'll talk about the reports and issues as we go through. Just show you how we can do that. Not surprisingly, it's Git behind the scenes. So we have pull requests. So most people working with Git are probably used to doing pull requests where we ask other team members to review the code. But let's go through and we'll show you some parts of this. So I said everybody should, hopefully, have been set up with a source repository. If you click on that, that will take you through. That will show you one repository, which should be called Code Repo, hopefully.
Yeah, I'm 0.
You're a 0. What's your username?
Still dash panda.
Okay. Do we have... I don't know if we have any spare IDs. How's everybody else doing? Other people got repos?
Yeah, we've got spare IDs. Have any been used yet?
Yeah.
We have got some, yeah.
I used the third one.
You used number 3?
Yeah.
Okay, so you can try this one. Do you want to go back to the...
I've got a blank screen.
You've got a blank screen. Sorry, beverage problem.
A minute ago though, I got an error that popped up saying it's not you, it's us.
Oh, well, at least I'm being honest. It is preview after all. If you would like, do you want to try either go to the URL again or try refreshing the screen? It might even be our network in here, so. We'll just let everybody catch up. If people want to click through Code Repo. For the people who have got access, it should look something like that. Thank you very much. It's not the tech that goes wrong, although I'm sure it's got plenty of opportunities to do that as it goes. Okay. Did you get sorted out with an alternate?
Yeah,
Is it working now?
it's working now.
Excellent. Cool. I'll just quickly take you through this. This is a mirror of the GitHub repo we showed you earlier, the DevOps Playground one. It's probably easier to follow along in the GitHub. The reason I will say that is the rendering of the READMEs is interesting at the minute. That might just be my README, but it works in GitHub. It's just in here, it does some interesting things. So as you scroll down, in some of the sub READMEs, the images don't work. But if you look on the GitHub, they do. You can follow along there. The READMEs, as I say, are all on the GitHub. If you want to follow along there, feel free to do so. There are screenshots, so if you get a little bit lost, hopefully, you can follow along through there. Okay, so we talked about repositories. We have some example code in here. It's just a really, really simple Python Lambda that we're going to use. It basically sits behind an API gateway. We can call that through the internet. Each one of those Lambdas talks to a central database. It just keeps a count of how many times we've called it. So that's all the Lambda does. It's not very clever. I'm not going to claim to be the greatest Python, so don't worry about the code in there. People can probably do far better on there. The other thing that we have got in here, you'll see there's a folder called unit tests. Python has a library called PyTest, which lets you do automated testing of the code. We're going to use that as we build the workflows out. Again, don't dig too deeply into those. They're enough to get us doing what we need to do today. We also have a folder called Terraform. Anybody who's used Terraform before probably looks fairly familiar. Again, it's not hugely complex. We're not using modules, anything like that. It's simple enough code just that we can do the demo today. Get us through the workshop. Okay. Everybody happy with the repository? It's a Git repo. You've used GitHub, Bitbucket, works in the same way. We can click through, we could edit files in here. It's not normally the way we're going to work, but you could do it we can do commits, we can create files, all of those kind of things. Very similarly to most of those tools, you could go through and you could look at the commits. This is where, okay, that's not too bad. I was going to say you could see my terrible commit messages, but yeah. So we've got a repository. We can make changes to that code, we can amend it, pretend this is real stuff that we're rolling out. You're going to have a team working on this. What we need to do is something with that code. So let's build out a workflow, that pipeline we talked about. So if you want to, you'll see here it says CI/CD. There's a little drop down arrow at the end. If you click on that, we get a few options. Not surprisingly, we're going to go into workflows. If you could check that, please. Okay. Probably no big surprise. These are all new spaces that we've set up, so there are no workflows already. So what we're going to do is, not surprisingly, click Create Workflow. So this is where we're creating now the pipeline that's going to do something with that code. There are a number of ways that we can work with the workflows. We have a YAML editor, which you can see here. So behind the scenes, the workflows are coded in YAML. Fairly standard, there's nothing clever about this. We could also edit, there's a kind of a GUI in front of this. And we'll use the GUI to start. So when we create the workflow, it gives us a default name. Wonderful human readable thing. We can change that. If you up in the top corner, top right hand, just underneath the big commit button, I'll see if I can make that any bigger. Hopefully easier to see now. We have a button, Workflow Properties. If we click on that, the main thing here is a name. So I'd suggest call it example for now. It will work with any name, not surprisingly, but the code I'm going to show you later on refers to example, so it's just a slightly easier one to follow along with.
Simon, we've got a question on the chat here.
Yep.
Is there any support with Pulumi? P-U-L-U-M-I.
Good question. What I would say is, so the Terraform support here isn't built in. What we're doing with the Terraform is we download it as we're going through. So the same way we download Terraform to our desktop, we're going to install it into the pipeline, and then we're going to use it just as a tool from the command line. If Pulumi can do that, then the answer is yes. Okay. We do have options here in how the pipelines are going to work. Just leave the defaults. As it says there, basically, the runs of the pipeline will get queued up. If you run it several times, they will wait until each one is finished. You can change the options on that. You could have parallel ones, various ways of doing that. Okay, and this is why I wrote the readmes. Give me a second. I just want to follow along with the instructions I'm telling people who are going to come along later. So we're in step 1. We've created the workflow. We've changed it to visual, given it a name. So I'll just find my tab. First thing, we're going to change how the workflow is triggered. You'll see the only thing that we have in here, other than my workflow properties, once you put a name on there, click the X, come out, you'll see the name at the top changes to match whatever you put in. Click on that. So this is changing how we trigger the workflow now. So you can have workflows that are manually triggered. You can have ones at the minute. You can either trigger on a push to the repository or a pull request, or both. You can also set it to trigger on the branch that you're using as well. So I'm just going to use that. But what we'll do is we'll leave that in the default. So it's just going to, every time we push into the repository, that's going to kick off a run of the workflow as we go. So feel free to look at that, but if you click X, it's great. We know how we're going to trigger it, so let's tell it what to do now. Over here at the top, we've got actions. If you click on that, in the same way that we had blueprints, it will give us some examples here. So we have build actions, test, we can deploy CloudFormation stacks. It gives us a number of predefined tools that we can use. If you just want to click on build, you can either click on the build title, in which case it will give you some information about what a build does. So a little bit of documentation there. It will tell you what it looks like. You can look at the structure of a build step. So the identifier tells it is a build. The build is the name of that step. We can change that, and we will change that. Inputs tells us where it's going to get its code from. In this case, the workflow source. That just means the repository, the Git repository that we've set up behind the scenes. So it will pull down the repository, like a lot of tools. We then give it a configuration telling it what it's going to do. And we basically, anybody who's used to Linux, Macs, we give it a set of bash commands. It's Linux based behind the scenes. And we can have inputs into this step, and we can have outputs. So we can share information between the steps, and we'll show this, we'll demonstrate why that's important shortly. So feel free to look through those. I'm not going to go too much in detail, but if for the people who are following along, if you click add to workflow, and it will give us, I'm just going to zoom out a little bit because it's getting a little bit crowded on there. Okay, I'll close that action down. We've got the thing we want now. So you'll see we have a trigger up here. Visually underneath, we can see the action that we're going to do. Don't worry about inputs at the moment. We're going to leave those as defaults for this activity. If you go to configuration, again, we can change the name on this. Again, just to follow along with the examples we've got, if you change that to init. And if you scroll down, you can see a section called shell commands. So this is where we're going to tell this step what to do. So if you look in the README, rather than expecting you to all type along as I read out what to do, we have put in the READMEs some example code. You can copy that from there. And what we'll do is, in that section there, shell commands, we'll just paste that code in. Did everybody get the DevOps Playground GitHub? That code is in the repository as well. So if you go to step 1, folder in the repository, the code's in there. We are on, let's see which step we're at. Step 910 in the README. So grab the code from there. Step 8, actually. Sorry, I can't even read my own READMEs. And once we're happy with that, we're going to leave everything else as default. So we're just going to make some minor changes to get those in there. Did everybody get the code? Copied, pasted? Everybody all right in the room? I will assume so. What we're going to do now is some checks. There's a big validate button at the top. This is going to check that the code that we're putting in is sensible. It's just doing a logic check. It's not doing anything over and above. It's just saying, do I recognize the syntax of this? Click validate. Hopefully everybody gets the workflow definition is valid. If you don't, please shout out. Good. And what this has done behind the scenes is this has created a YAML file in our repository, and it's starting to build these steps into that code. It's sitting in a repository, so we're going to use Git. We are going to do a commit to push this change into that repository. So in this case, it's taken the name of the workflow we gave earlier, example.yaml. Again, good idea to use that. It'll make it easier to follow along. You don't have to. Use whatever you name. Let's put a useful commit message. Okay, maybe not that useful. And if you choose the repository, you could be working with multiple repositories here. It doesn't have to go into the one. You could have several that we're pushing it into. Choose code repo and main, and click commit. That's just doing a git commit behind the scenes. Like everything, it will sit, it'll do its little twirly thing for a minute.
Sam, just while that's doing that, the git commit that it's doing in the background, is that committing to a clone repo on GitHub?
In this case, we have built the repositories in the project.
Right.
So when you click on the source repositories, if you were creating one from scratch, it will, if you go into source repositories, click create, it'll say either create one, that puts it in the project. You can link to, as I say, GitHub ones as well. Yeah.
Is there a way to manage the same workflow for different repositories at the same time?
Yes. So obviously we're doing this from scratch. The idea is that most people will probably have a set of common or standard workflows. So you could see that maybe one way you do that is you would have a standard workflow repository where your repos would exist in, where the pipeline definitions would exist. You could link them both in there, and you could say, use this, but point it maybe through an environment variable or something to where your code is.
Yeah.
So yeah, you could definitely do that. Any other questions around our first step? All good. So we've created a pipeline, we put one action in there. If anybody looked at it, what it's basically doing is we're using Python, it's installing some Python libraries beforehand. You'll see that when I click commit, it brings us to a screen workflows. It tells us there is one workflow active at the moment. It tells us the repository where it is which branch it's in. If you were working on several branches, you could switch to the branch where you were working, but it would take you to where you were working. It tells us that in this case, it's the example workflow, it tells us the repository, the branch, it tells us the commit, tells us when we made the commit 2 minutes ago. But most importantly for this is it gives us a run ID. If you click on that, it will take us through to a visual representation of the run. So when we did the commit, it pushed that into the repository. If you remember, our trigger was a push into the repository. That initiated the workflow. So this is sitting here. We can see our links, and I can see I forgot to change the name to build from build 53 to init, but that's fine. If you click through to that where your first action is, it takes you through to a screen where we can see what's happening in that step. In this case, it's giving us some logs. So it's telling us everything it's doing. It's setting up the space where this is actually running. This is all in the cloud, obviously. It's downloading the source. If you open that up, it's telling you what it's doing there. So we mentioned behind the scenes, this is using code commit. You can see from the URL there. That's where it's coming from. And all we're doing is just some pip installs. You can open up each of those so you can see the output as if it was a bash command. Make sure that it's running as you expect. If you have problems, you can use that to debug what your problems are. Okay. I won't go through all of this. Anybody who's used pip, this is all going to be familiar. And it said on the bottom there, action succeeded. We know that has worked. It's got a green tick next to it. It ran as we expected, which is good. Any questions around that first step of the workflow?
Yeah, we've got a question online saying, can a project be attached to multiple spaces, or does each project have its own space?
As far as I'm aware, a project is got one space. You could attach a GitHub repository, for example, to multiple projects. So if your code is sitting in an external repository, you can do that. You can attach the repository. If it's a repository inside CodeCatalyst, it's tied to the project. If you knew the URL, you might be able to extract. I've never tried it, but generally, if it's a CodeCatalyst repository, it's project-based. If it's external, link it to as many as you want. You've got the flexibility there. Okay, I'll tell you what I'm just going to do. So one thing you can do from here is edit the workflow. I'm just going to, whilst I remember, change that so it's got init at the top. Just as I say, I use some names and it's easier. So I'll just validate again and commit that. And that's going to run in the background. Okay. So again, these are all in the README. Feel free to follow along there. we are down to, I'm in the right one, step 1. Yeah, as it says, review the log session. That's our first step, building our first action in there. So down at the bottom of the README, this will work in the DevOps playground. One probably won't work if you're following along in the local repo in the project. Go to the top of the folder, go into step 2. So we've got an action there that's getting our environment ready to deploy, well, the code's deployed, but to do something with it, run unit tests, scan it, make sure it's valid, do our deployments, etc. We've got the environment that we wanted, it's installed the Python libraries that we need. So what we're going to do in step 2 is build some testing. So what we're going to do, if you want to follow along in here, I'll demo it for the people in the room and online, is come back to our workflow. Hopefully my run has finished. If it hasn't, I'll leave it going in the background because it will take me long enough on this. Yeah, mine's still running in there. If I come out to my workflows, there's various ways you can do it. You can come out to the workflows, choose your workflow, click on the edit button. That's probably the easiest way. Click edit. And what we're going to do is add a test phase, a test action. I'm going to switch to, let me make sure I'm following along with what I say in here. Okay. So as it says, we're going to use the YAML editor this time. So rather than working with a nice GUI, we're going to work with the underlying code. There is a set of code in there. All this code does at the minute is try to run PyTest, just to make sure that the environment's working. So if you want to copy that, scroll down to the bottom. What I would say is make sure you're at the beginning of the line. It's YAML. If you don't get, anybody who's worked with YAML knows it is a little bit pedantic about indentation. So paste that there. So as I say, the code is in the repo. I'll give people time here to copy that, paste it in. I'll walk through what we've got. You'll see we have now a new action called test phase. It is a test action. That's what the identifier tells us. The first one was a build identifier. This is test one. They do different things behind the scenes. Don't worry too much. They're running commands at the end of the day. Again, the input is coming from a repository. It's doing some auto-discovery reports. We'll talk about those reports in a minute. But all it's doing in the configuration, it does one single thing. It runs Python PyTest -- help. So it's just telling us how to run the command. I'm doing this to demo something, which will hopefully be obvious in a minute. There's a question at the back. Oh. Excellent. One important thing, and this is why I changed the name to init, because my copy-paste code down at the bottom, it says depends on init. If we switch to the visual editor, because it depends on that first action, it puts it in flow with it. You could have them running in parallel. If you haven't got a depends, it will run those actions in parallel. You could have several actions. The next action could depend on all of the previous ones. So you could fan out, run 3 or 4 things in parallel, come back in. Okay, hopefully everybody has had time to validate, to put that code in. Again, we'll validate and commit it. If people need me to slow down a little bit, please let me know. I'm used to the content in here. Okay, so add test action. And again, I'm just going to do a commit. That will trigger that run because we've pushed new code into the repository. And if we come to the runs at the top, you'll see I've got 2 previous runs there because I changed the name. That triggered the second one. We've now got the change that we've just done. If I clicked on that commit, it would show me the changes I've done. It's telling me when I did it, as I said. Just click through on the name there, the run ID, so we can see the progress. So this one, we're still on the first stage. We can click on that. We'll see those logs again. It'll show us the steps that it's going through. It will tell us when it's finished. Unfortunately, I can't do the Blue Peter thing and say, here's one I prepared earlier. We've got to wait for it to finish. If anybody's got any questions, this is a good time. I know that by the time we've finished, the pipeline takes about 3 or 4 minutes to run through every time. Okay, so it's doing various things. It's built out the libraries, and when that finishes, what we should see is down in the test phase, the next action will kick off. If you put bash commands in, it expects those to finish successfully. Anybody who's used to bash, if the status comes out isn't 0, it will flag that as an error. It will stop the workflow. Okay, I'm just waiting for the test phase to carry on here.
Got a quick question.
Yeah.
Is there a way to handle non-zero error codes in Bash if you wish to do so? Because I know for Terraform you can add extra options
but I'll say,
to get.
if you look at the examples, because the YAML that's underlying this, I haven't got the editor open, I won't switch screens. It can do multi-line YAML, so I'm running I'm putting several commands into each of those steps. I do that. There's some of them later on will have true at the end, so it's the last statement that executes. It's not a single statement in the step, it's what does it finish with? What does the step finish with? So as long as you get a 0 coming out of that, the easiest way to force that, true. Okay. Oh dear, it failed. Luckily, it was meant to. I'm doing this to demonstrate something. So if you notice, test phase has got a red cross next to it, and it tells us failed while executing shell commands. If you open that up, we can go to the logs, scroll down. We can see what it failed on. In this case, it's the PyTest. Open that up. No module named PyTest. But in the first step, I install the libraries. And I promise you, if you look at the code, there is a PyTest in there that's being installed. Anybody want to hazard a guess at why that failed? I won't make you wait too long. What it is each of those actions runs in a separate container instance. Things aren't automatically copied between those spaces. We have to tell it. If you remember, we saw a space in there for artifacts. It was saving artifacts, loading artifacts. You have to copy stuff between. Now, you could argue we could just put everything in one action. That's fine. But a lot of places that I've worked with, they'll build their environment, then they'll do the test stages, then they'll do the deploy. Especially if you are running standard things together, if you've got those standardized stuff that you want to use. One of the things is if you're using GitHub, for example, you could be importing GitHub actions. If you've got those as separate actions, it will respect that. So what I have in the code, if we carry on down, what we're going to do is change that second, well, we're going to change the first work step, it's the first action. We're going to export the Python libraries. There's some code in here that will do that. If you scroll down to say, so why did we fail? So in the step 2 README, there's a section that says, why did we fail? Item 2 in there has some code. What we're going to do is take that code, put it in the first action. And what that's doing, actually that's turning off, it says, replace that code that you can see with the code that's underneath. So copy the second one. If you copy the first one, it will fail again. But once you've copied the code, come back into your workflow, edit workflow. And what you are looking for is this section here. So lines 17 to 20 in my case. Hopefully they're all fairly similar. So make sure you're in the init, the first action, and you're looking at the outputs. If you replace that section where it says auto discover reports If you paste the code in, it will still have the auto-discovery reports, but it's added artifacts. What that does is, you'll see we're given it a name, Python libs. So Python libraries, that's just where we're sending it. And we tell it what files we want in there. These run as root inside the containers. There's an argument about whether that's a good idea, but it's what it does. If you do, you'll see that lower down I'm doing a pip install user. It's just so I know where the libraries are going. Those libraries will get installed as a user under root.local. So we just save all of those. And I won't go ahead until people are ready, but back in the README, so that first action, we've exported the artifact. The second action, we're going to read it in. So line 4, or section 4 of the README is going to look something like this. We did an outputs, now we're going to do an inputs in the second action. So scroll down to our test phase, where you see the inputs. Once you've copied the code, inputs, tell it where it's coming from, give it the name of the Python library's artifact, so it knows which one to pick up. However, that just loads it into that container. It doesn't know what to do with it, it just knows that it's got those files there. So again, in the README, there is a set of steps where it's got the pytest -- help. Copy the second section of code, replace the bit that it shows there. The first step in there, if you look at it, it's doing some copying. So what it does is, when it imports that artifact, it always puts it in a place that it knows about. That path is built of catalyst, source, dir, then the name of the artifact. And all we're doing is using Unix commands to move it from where the artifact is to where we want it to be, in this case, the .local. And we set up a path just so if there's any executables in that particular module, we get access to them. 3 other commands, we're actually going to do some unit testing now. The first command, running unit tests, calling Python pytest, straightforward Python unit tests. The second command is using an open source tool called Bandit. Bandit is a vulnerability scanner for Python. It's looking for us doing silly things. I have added a line in the code, so we get an example. It's not enough to break it, but it will flag a warning. You'll see that I'm using true on the end of that command. The reason is that because it sees a line that it's flagging as a warning, it gets a non-zero status. So I want to override that. The final step in here is we're going to run a tool called tfsec. A lot of people running Terraform probably familiar to this. It does something similar to Bandit. It scans your Terraform to make sure you're doing sensible things. Again, we will get a couple of warnings out of this, but we override it with the true. The other thing that we're doing, if you look at those, is we are outputting the results to a specific place, a folder called JUnit, and then a file. The reason for that is, as we go through, we're going to pick those reports up, that output. But if you want to copy that second set of code, go back to your workflow, find the section where it's got steps, run Python pytest. Select that and replace that text. So go to the first step, select the bash commands, just do a copy paste. Did I overwrite that? Run? I think I did. You're right, thank you. I overwrote that. Well, I'll tell you what, let me show you what it will do. Because the next step is to press validate. Okay, I put some logic in there it doesn't understand. It's not just looking, is this valid YAML? It's got logic around what is a valid workflow.
Simon, I know you're going on to talk about reports next, but
I am.
I've got a kind of linked question. Does CodeCatalyst keep track of versioning with each build? In
what way? So what it will do is, as you run the reports, you can go back in the history and see the previous reports from previous runs, if that's what the question is towards.
I think perhaps just versioning of the code base.
So if you remember when we were in the workflow, it shows us the commit ID. What I'll show you when we run this in a second is you can see the previous runs, so you can go back and look at it. We're obviously hoping that when we eventually run this one, it will give us a good run, but you could go back and look, why did it fail earlier? Why did it work? Whatever changed? So you can go back and look at that history.
I have a question as well. When you set the compute capability,
Yeah.
If you're running maybe large parallel workflows or I guess large stages, will CodeCatalyst handle auto-scaling, or do you set that as part of the in the compute section? Or
in
how
the
does that work?
configuration, I'll try and remember to go back and show you, you tell it how big you want the instances to be that it's using. So we're using, it gives you very small ones by default because they're cheap. But you can override that and tell it you want to use larger instances.
And how many it could scale to, I guess?
Good question. So I think it will run one container per action, but if you've got, remember we said if you haven't got that depends on, you could run those steps in parallel. So that could be one way. If your workload is too large, scale it out, use multiple actions there. So we're doing the unit tests all in here. You could have an action for each set of unit tests, let them run in parallel. That's probably going to be a little bit quicker. Okay, let's see if I've remembered the code syntax. Validate, yay. How's everybody doing in terms of the code? We good? Okay, we will try running this in a second. But, so we've replaced that. As it said, do the validate, just make sure that bit's working. Make sure we get valid code. We've shown you how to put the steps in to run those test reports, make sure that things work as we expect them to. If you scroll down to section 5 in the step 2 README, there is a section of code here. This is how you tell CodeCatalyst what your reports are that you want to retrieve. You can do auto discovery. So if you know that you're going to have a load of XML files, for example, coming out, you can say, find all the XML files under a particular path. If you do that, you can only set one set of criteria for all of the files. So you could say, I've got to have a 90% pass on all of the files underneath this. What we're actually going to do with this one is be more specific, so we can use different criteria for the different tests. So again, you can copy and paste that. Notice this time it's got the reports at the top, so when I paste this, hopefully I won't make a mistake where I paste it. So this is going to go into our test action. So let's make sure I'm in the test phase. I am. And you'll see, if you're following along in the README, it says, go to the section with the auto discover reports, click to the end of that line. We're gonna, because this is an output, we're outputting reports. It goes in the output section. It is always a good idea to just check the indentation if you're working directly in YAML. Copy and paste can do wonderful things, as we know sometimes. But at the end of the day, we have our validate command. Okay, I'm going to go with people in the room as kind of a gauge of speed. So if you let me know once you've got that, you've validated, we're good. You're probably not going to be surprised. We're going to commit it. Push it to the repository.
Can you go back up to the indentation?
Yeah. So the reports sits at the same level as auto discover reports. You can see there, I've turned this off because I don't want it to discover all of the reports underneath here. Unfortunately, if I remember correctly, I didn't turn it off earlier on. So you will see a couple of extra files coming in, but we'll concentrate on these. You'll see the one I'm generating here is a report called test report, one called coverage report, one called Python vulnerability, one called Terraform vulnerability. CodeCatalyst, if you're using these tools, most of them have a standardized output. So JUnit for unit testing. Vulnerability has this wonderful thing called Sarif. You'll see that you tell it the format of the data it's importing, so it knows what it's working with. And you'll also see I'm setting criteria. So what defines a successful run. In this case, I don't want any high level vulnerabilities coming through. When I look at the tests, I'm being very optimistic. I want 100% pass rate on my unit tests and 90% code coverage. So it's not just looking at the logic we're running, it's looking how much of the code we test. So I validated that already, so I'm just going to do a commit. Add testing steps and export, import of the archive. Yeah, that's quite a good message for myself. Normally change things. Yeah, fix stuff.
Seems like another good time for a question,
Yeah.
Simon. Is there a reason? Oh, I've lost it now. It was essentially someone saying, is there a reason why that subdirectory was called JUnit, since this is
No.
Python, not Java?
No, you could use whatever. It's just by default the PyTest, because a lot of the unit test background comes from Java. JUnit is that standard library. I'll be perfectly honest. One of the places I'm working at the minute, that's where their code goes. And so, yeah, it can go where. If you remember in the commands that we were running, it told it there was an output section. In fact, let me show you. If I scroll up in here, you'll see in here, I specifically tell it to output to JUnit. It could be wherever you want. It doesn't have to be that. You could have unit test results, whatever works. This is just kind of the format I'm used to working with at the minute. So I did say, don't try and tear my code down too much. It's just an example. Okay, so we click the commit. That will take us back to our workflow. You'll notice there 15 minutes ago that failed. If we come into the runs, there's probably a run in progress. If yours has finished already, if you're not seeing anything in the active runs, have a look in the previous runs, but it's probably not done. To that question about seeing the history of the runs, you can see there, active runs. So that's the one that's going at the minute. It's got its run ID. If you scroll down, all of the runs we've made in this so far, they're visible. So you could go back and look at the history. Okay, so the red X there. The last time we ran this, it failed because it couldn't find the libraries. We've imported those. Hopefully, if I click the right one, this time it'll run through. One thing I will say as well while we're going through, there is a CLI for CodeCatalyst. Again, I haven't got the link to hand, but if you Google CodeCatalyst CLI AWS, you'll get to the page. The setup is a little bit strange because you have to, if anybody's used to the AWS config files where you put your credentials in, you have to, if you remember, CodeCatalyst is in its own account, so you have a specific syntax you have to put in there. But once you've got that, you can link to the CodeCatalyst and run the commands. It is early days, we're in preview, so there are some interesting omissions in there. You can create a branch in a repository, for example, through the CLI. What you can't do yet is create a repository. Okay, that's me just talking while we wait for our run to go through. Okay, test phase. Well, that's good. We've got a green tick this time. I will let people, actually, yours might be running in there, but I'll go through what I've got. Hopefully you're going to get something similar. If you haven't, the code is in the README, as I mentioned. And actually, if I remembered, in the Steps 2 folder, there are some example YAML files. So if you're having problems getting this code working, feel free just to grab the YAML file, paste it into the workflow YAML, take it from there. Don't try and fix stuff. You can work that out later on. The good news is, PyTest ran this time. We've got a green tick, as did the other tests that ran. I don't know how, anybody else got green ticks in there yet? We're all good, excellent. So, I could take you, I'll just show you this one for example. Somebody asked about Pulumi and can it integrate with that? This stage, we're just downloading TFSec, as I mentioned. We'll do the same with Terraform when we work with that. Because we've got Bash, we can download stuff into the environment where we're running this. We can run those commands. So you'll see here, all this does is, it does a wget to get TFSec. You might have that sitting in a local library somewhere if you've got Nexus or some other tool. But it just goes out to the web and grabs that at the minute. Yay, lots of wget stuff. I really should have put quiet in there, but it gets there and then it saves that as a file called TFSec that it's downloaded. We've also got a section generate reports. So I'm hoping, if I get back to the top up here, first of all, that phase worked, that action actually worked this time because we exported the libraries from the first step, re-imported them. 4 reports. If you remember the lines I gave it in the configuration, we're going to have coverage report, test report, Python vulnerability and Terraform vulnerability. I think I said those. But what you can see is, if you remember, I set those criteria. So it's comparing those results to the criteria. So it's not just did those commands finish, but are they meeting the criteria that we set? That's a fairly standard step in pipelines. It's not just did it work, but are we meeting whatever our standards are? Different places will have different standards. They might have 75% code coverage, something like that. Let's have a quick look at these. If anybody's used PyTest, it's going to give us output that's probably fairly familiar in here. So if you look in the test report, it tells us we've got a pass rate of 100%. So my code's not that bad. However, there's only something like 30 lines in there, so hopefully. It tells us the tests we ran. If you went and look in the unit test directory in there, there are 6 tests set up with those names. As always, don't just test for success, test things fail if you give it bad criteria, for example. Make sure things fail the way we expect them to. So everything worked. It tells us how long that took. I could either go back to the reports or I can choose a different report here. Look at the coverage report. It will tell us how many lines of the code we tested. 97%, which was 30. I told you it wasn't huge. 32 lines of code, we didn't test one of them. If you scroll down, it will tell you the names of the files it looked at when it was testing. If you click through, it will show you which lines it tested. So you can actually see what you've tested. Are there gaps in there? Is there stuff we've missed? If it's in green, it's tested it. It doesn't do great if you try and be tidy with your code. So you'll notice it's got the return. It's tested the return. I've just tried to make my code readable. The one line it doesn't get is this one down at the bottom. I've got code that just lets me run the Lambda locally. That's what that section's doing. When it runs as Lambda, it comes in through Lambda handler, which is fairly standard for most people. That's the code coverage. It tells us how many lines we've tested, which ones we've done. The other reports, these are just example reports. You don't necessarily have to be using these, but you can see them in here. I mentioned that the Python vulnerability, I put one line in to make sure it flagged an error. It tells me the level of that error. It's an informational one. If I click through on that B311, it tells me what the error is. I told it to import the random library. It thinks I might be trying to use that to do some cryptographic work. It says that's probably not a good idea, but it's a low-level one, so it's fine. Something similar with the Terraform. It is going to complain. When we build out the Terraform, it's going to deploy an API gateway with the Lambda behind it. It's telling me one of the things is that I haven't put any authentication on the API gateway. You normally do that. In this case, I'm keeping the code simple. It's also telling me I didn't put encryption on the log group from the Lambda. So you can see this is a really useful step. We're making sure that the code is secure, there's no vulnerabilities, and it works as we expect. Any questions on that?
Another one online. Can we monitor the output of a project on CodeCatalyst? And this person's giving the example of, for instance, CloudWatch or any third-party monitoring.
There are some metrics, but I don't know if there's a success or failure metric. I haven't looked at those yet. I know the metrics are there, but what the level of information is, again, pop it in repost. Somebody will come back to you. Sorry, that's an easy get out now. If anybody asks a difficult question, that's going to be my answer. Okay, so we have deployed our code environment, we've deployed the test, we know our code's good. We will come back to this in a minute and try deploying it into AWS. One thing I'm going to show you, I mentioned dev environments earlier. I want to show you what they look like. So dev environment is that virtual environment where you can make sure that all of your developers get the same tools to work with. So I'll just show you how we set those up. I will show you in Cloud9, that's in the instructions in step 3 of the repository if you want to follow along, or you can follow along with what I'm doing on the screen. I will also show you how to set that up with VS Code. As I mentioned earlier, other editors are available, but I use VS Code, so that's what I'm doing. So, if you clicked on code at the side, over on the left-hand navigation panel, down at the bottom, we have dev environments. So, as I say, the aim behind dev environments is give our developers something safe. It takes us away from inconsistent environments on the laptops where people have put different libraries, different tools. We make sure that all our developers have the same set of tools and libraries available. Show you Cloud9 first of all. To do this, click in Create Dev Environment. It asks us where do we want to put this, so you can see the things we can integrate with. Cloud9, VS Code, IntelliJ, Golang, PyCharm, fairly standard tools. These will probably expand. I did ask the question in repost the other day, are they looking to make this other IDEs available, or will they open up those extensions so we can put our own in? What they've said is a very tactful answer. They're trying to make it as easy to use as possible. So we'll wait and see. But if you click on Cloud9, one of the things we try and do is, with the playgrounds, keep everything in the cloud. We're not going to install stuff locally. So it's asking me, the dev environment, do I want to use the repository that I got? The answer is yes, so we'll keep that as default. You could create this and clone a repository later. So if you wanted to pull in a repository from somewhere else, you can do that. It will ask you which code repo you want. In this case, code repo, the one we set up with the example code. I'm going to keep life simple. I'm just going to use the main branch. You'll see it does have their working new branch. So you could, in here, create a new branch if you were working on a feature or a hot fix or something along those lines. Whatever your branching strategies are, you can do that as well. You can give it an alias, give it a nice name. And people were asking about the compute space. In the same way, you can change the compute space on your workflow. If you're going to be working with beefy tools in your developer environment, you can do that. I'm just going to keep the standard ones here. You'll see that gives us a couple of CPUs, 8 gig of RAM, 16 gig of storage. It's got a timeout on there as well. So if you stop using the dev environment, it will stop it after 15 minutes. So you're not getting charged. Remember, we had that free tier that gives you, I think it was 60 minutes of dev environment to start with. So we probably don't want to exceed that if we're wanting to stay in free tier. Okay. And it will sit and spin a minute. The reason this is taking a little while is it's spinning up a container in the background. Okay. If people are following along, and people doing this in the room as well, online, it will give you some pop-ups. For now, just click the Don't Show Again and close that Getting Started. The Getting Started is our usual welcome thing. If you've used VS Code, it's fairly similar when you're starting a new project. It just gives you a bit of info. You can see the Cloud9 documentation in there. So remember, we told it we wanted to clone the repo in. Market repo is called code repo. You'll see over here, it's put the code in the space we're working with. All of the file structure under there is as we use. I mentioned that the workflows just go in a YAML file. It puts them into a folder structure called .CodeCatalyst/workflows, and there's the example.yaml. If I open that up, that's the same code we went through the visual editor with. You can see all of my other stuff's in here. the steps for the readmes, the Terraform, that's all in there. So this gives us that standardized environment that I was saying. You'll notice at the bottom, if anybody's used EC2s, for example, that's a fairly similar prompt. You'll see it's just telling us the IP of the space that we're working in. So it's not our desktop, it's a virtual space. Okay. This is what sets up our environment. There is a standard for developer environments. There's a tool called devfile. I think it's devfile.io, something like that, if you want to look at the syntax. It's obviously slightly modified because we're putting things in here like how much storage you want, but you'll see it's using Docker, so it's a container. We just go through some steps, install that code. I'm not going to do too much in the dev files, I just want to give you an idea that it's a standardized environment we can all work in, we've got the same space. Okay. But I did mention that it will also tie in with VS Code, the editor that I use, for example. I'm just going to start this up just a little bit faster. Actually, I'll just click on resume. Oh, okay, I haven't got I will create one now. So create development environment. If you've got VS Code, click on the VS Code instead of Cloud9. Same questions. Do you want your repository? Do you want a new branch? Do you want the CPUs, the memory? Sorry. That's telling us it's going to give us a virtual environment that we can work with. That's probably because I've tried to create two Cloud9s. Sorry, yeah, this is the question here. I'll come to this in a second.
Yeah, since everything runs in a Docker container, is it possible to use a compute that is not from AWS, but a local one?
Not at the moment.
No.
It's something they're interested in. So you'll see that you do have the option. Actually, that's not entirely true, sorry. I think you can use standard images. What you can't use is if you've got your own container registry, you can't pull in from there yet, but it's something they want to do.
Okay.
So not yet is probably the short answer.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. This is one of this will be the bit. I said it was in preview. Something was going to catch me. This will be the bit. Let's try that again. It might be because I've already got that set up, but let's give that a try. Finding the repository, dev environment for this repository and branch already exists. Okay, I'll just tell it it's to create a new branch then. So, no, planned, obviously. Work in a new branch, you tell it the name of the branch that you want to work with, where it's going to get its code from, main in this case. And if this still fails, okay, so I told it to create a VS Code. It has spun up, or is spinning up an environment, but it's asking me, or telling me, it will need a builder ID for VS Code. Again, sorry, I apologize for small fonts. I work on a big monitor normally. It's just asking me, can it use the builder ID to connect into the environment? I'm going to say yes. Don't worry too much about following along with this. If you have got VS Code or other editors, there's documentation online. I just wanted to demo. And do I want VS Code to see the external website where CodeCatalyst is? Yes. So it will now do an authentication into that space. Behind the scenes, we just have to say, yes, let VS Code see my data. Okay, and as it says, VS Code can see our data. So if we come back, there we go, it's opening it up for us. So what it's doing here is it's spinning up that container. You'll see at the bottom it's saying setting up SSH host. Do I trust the people? It's my code. I'm going to say yes for now. Okay. So VS Code. First thing, I can see my code at the side here, my code repo. All of those, if you've been looking through and looking at the structure, it's the same thing. We've got our SRC with a Python code, we've got Terraform. I can open these up. I could edit them here. make changes, run my tools, push them back to the repo. When it does push, it will push it back to the repository in CodeCatalyst. If I open a terminal here, normally that would open a terminal in your local laptop. It's just basically working. Again, it's giving me that prompt that looks something like an EC2 or a container. I'm actually now talking to a virtual space in the cloud. So again, it's going to put that virtual environment in with all the tools that we need that have been defined in the dev file. Okay. So, as I say, I'm not going to do too much with the dev files, or at least not the VS Code, but I just wanted to show you it will work with other tools. Excellent. Any questions on that so far? Anything online? We're good?
So if you're running a Python file, you don't need to install Python?
Yeah, because the remote environment has got Python installed. That's one of the things. I think they all come with Python, but if you wanted specific libraries, pandas, PyTest, you set that up in the dev file. That sits inside your repository. So everybody who opens the repository gets that standard set of tools. Nope. Okay, I'm just going to come out of there. One step left, you'll be pleased to hear. For the people in the room, there will be some pizza afterwards as a bit of an incentive and a thank you for sticking with us. Unfortunately for the people online, I can't send you pizza. But I hope you have something nice to finish with. Anyway, back to CodeCatalyst. So the final step. We've built our environment, we've checked the code, we know that it wants to do it. What we want to do. So we're going to try and deploy this into, you remember that diagram I showed you with the architecture, CodeCatalyst linked to the IAM roles in our environments. We've set up for each of you an environment. You don't have to set anything up behind the scenes. It's just pointing to an AWS environment. What you basically do is you say the account number of the ID, the role that you want to run. It does some validation when you set that up to make sure that you've got permissions to write where you're supposed to be writing. For people who are following along, we're going to jump to step 4. Wow, I missed step 3 completely, so I hope I didn't skip too much on there. Step 4, deploying code to AWS. So again, we are going to put the code in. I opened that dev environment. Let's put the stuff in through there. You could either use the dev environment, Cloud9. If you want to, you could just edit it through the code repository, but let's use the dev environment for now. Okay, so resume in Cloud9 since that's running. We're deploying into Terraform. One of the things we're doing with this Terraform code, don't worry too much, we're storing the state for this in the cloud. We're doing multiple runs in that container. Remember I said those containers come and go. Unless we're archiving that state file off, we're going to lose it. What we do instead, it's a fairly standard thing, we write it into an S3 bucket in the AWS account instead. So if you open the Terraform folder and open aws.tf, this is defining where that code is going to go. What I would like you to do, please, if we don't do this, it makes things fun. The key, that tells us which file it's going to store the state in. It's a bad idea if we all use the same state. If you want to put your Panda name in there, so if you can still remember it, I was Funny Panda. If you're using VS Code or you've used Cloud9 before, it's fairly similar code key bindings. So if you're on a Mac, Command S, I think you can do Control S in Windows. Or if you can't remember what they are, File, Save. Okay. I'm just going to check I've got all of the steps I need in here, so we do that. And what we're going to do, because we're in the dev environment, we're using the editor there, we are going to put, again, another action. So in the step 4 README, step 5, it has some code. So we'll take that, we'll copy it, come back to the developer environment, and close the AWS TF if you've saved the key change. Remember I said it puts the workflows in .CodeCatalyst/workflows. Ours is called example. This is why I said use example at the beginning to keep life simple. And also told you which names to use for the stages. Scroll down to the bottom. So it's going to be around about line 100. Look for that depends on init. That's the end of the test action. Remember we said the test action depended on the previous step. New line, again, it's YAML. Just be careful with that indentation and paste that code in. I'll just walk you through. So we're not taking any artifacts this time. We're just going to run the Terraform from the code. You'll see that what we do is, this is what I was saying about indentation. Make sure that deploy Terraform to dev is outdented properly. It's joys of copy and paste. We're not doing anything with outputs this time. We're just going to take the bash output. What you'll notice though is we have this line, environment. So remember I said we've set up an environment for you, tying it to an AWS account. This is how we tell it which environment to use. So there is an environment called dev that connects to this account, our AWS account. This will link into the one that we've set up for the lab. CodeCatalyst deployment role, that's the IAM role that we've set up in our AWS account. So not the CodeCatalyst, this is how we control what CodeCatalyst does in our accounts. All it's doing in that role, I think I've got it somewhere in the repository, I'll make sure I put it in there. There is an IAM policy, it lets it, trying to remember, create API gateways, create a Lambda, it creates a role that the Lambda can use. So we're giving it permissions to do just those things. We're keeping it fairly tied down. We're telling it that this depends on the test phase. Notice previously the depends on was the end. As long as those steps are in there, it's not too worried about the order. Again, we're just taking our code from the repository and then we have the steps that we're actually doing. So what's that, 5 steps? First one just puts out an echo, hello world, our favorite message. We install Terraform. Anybody who's done this fairly standard, we're just taking the package from the Terraform website, download it, install it through Yum, because we're in Linux. We do a Terraform init that tells Terraform to pull down all of the code resources it needs from the Terraform website. People who haven't run Terraform, we're doing a Terraform plan that runs through the code. It tells us what it's going to create. So it's a little bit of a validity checker. What you could do there is you could put a step in and say, check this first as a separate action, have the Terraform apply. I can't remember yet whether you can actually put an approval stage in here. I know that they've talked about it. If it isn't there yet, hopefully it's coming soon. So you could actually say, I need somebody to approve this. Obviously, you're going to be doing pull requests when this is really live, checking your code as you go there. And the final thing it will do is a Terraform apply. It will push our code out into the AWS account we've connected it to. This is where you realize that using the editor that we've got is quite nice. There's no validate command when we run the dev environment, or there may be, I haven't seen anything in the documentation. There's nothing that you can run other than maybe a YAML lint just to make sure it's valid YAML. There isn't anything that's got the logic there to check that. Make sure you save that. So I'm going to be lazy, do a save. If anybody's used Cloud9, it's very similar to VS Code. We have an icon over here. You can manage Git through this. So if you prefer to stage your files, you can click. We should have 2 files that we need, an example.yaml, the workflow file, and the aws.tf. We should have said, please make sure before we push we've got both those files. We could plus here and put in a commit message, put the commit message in that way. If you prefer to use the git command line, we can do that. I'm going to use the command line. So, dip. I'll just tell it, check what files we got. Oh, I'm not in the code repo, in the command line. Okay, so 2 files to stage. I'm going slowly because, as I said at the beginning, always when I do demos, I make a mess when I'm typing. There's something about standing up in front of people. Your keyboard skills just go. Okay, so that's put it into the staging area. You'll see that it changed in the Git panel on the side as well. So it's moved from changes to staging area. Deploy stage. Okay, so we've committed that now to the local repository. So that's the repository sitting in the dev environment. What we now have to do is push it to the repository in CodeCatalyst. You can either do a git push, or very like VS Code, down at the bottom here, it's got like a little status bar telling you what the state of your repository compared to the remote repository is. It's saying we're 1 ahead. I could click on that down there. I'm used to the command line. I'm going to do it that way. Anybody who's used to git push, very standard output. It's telling us what it is that it's pushed up there, where it's gone, how much data, etc. Again, that's a push. Remember that workflow at the beginning? We told it, trigger the workflow when we get a push. So if we come back to our original tab, if I find it, I've had several open, I apologize. But if we come back to the CodeCatalyst console, come to workflows, we hope there is a job running. Okay. Recent runs, there we go, 1 minute ago, that's me. I'll click on the run ID. So if you remember before, we had the init stage and the test stage. We now have a deploy stage. This is where we're going to find out if I managed to put valid YAML in there as it gets down there. So it's going to go through the steps it did before. You'll see it's on the init at the moment. It's got the little blue lines. I know they're quite small, so I apologize if you can't see those. But it does say action is still in progress. We can open that up. You can follow the progress as it goes. It's going to jump into the test plan. Once it's done that, run its various tests. Then it is, if I've got the code right, try and deploy this into our AWS accounts using Terraform. While that's running, any questions, comments? Anybody need to catch up?
Is there any error handling with this? So if, say, if a phase failed and you wanted to send a notification email or trigger another phase based off of failure, is there anything to support that?
Good question about triggering on failure. I would need to check, repost, or look at the documentation. There is a lot of CodeCatalyst documentation. That CodeCatalyst.aws, if you remember when it opened up before we signed in, there's lots of information on there. There's a link to all of the documentation. There is developer documentation in terms of the APIs that underlie, and there's a general user guide. It's a very in-depth user guide. It takes you through the syntax of workflows, the order you put them in, what's standard. So there may be something in there that says, if this condition, trigger this. In terms of sending notifications, we've got the CLI. So we can run the bash commands, AWS, SNS, publish message, or if you want to use SES, something like that. So you could call the AWS CLI. Or if you've got an external tool that you're using, you could maybe be triggering something in PagerDuty. If you really want to get everybody out at 2 o'clock in the morning when your push fails, you probably won't be very popular, but you could do that or tie it into an external tool. Okay, let's see how we're doing. Okay, it has run all my tests. They have been successful. We're good there. It's just uploading the artifacts, generating the reports coming out of the end of the test phase. Hopefully in a second, it will fire off the deploy. How are people doing? Similar stage? Yeah.
I've got the connection is not valid for the error for the Terraform, so I think
Terraform for dev.
yeah.
Okay, let's see if I get the same one. Let me have a look at the code we pasted in. Have I got the right connection? His name is Dev. Give me a second, let's see if mine's going to run through, or if I get the same error. It's possible that when we've set up the environment, somebody hasn't, they've called it dev, maybe with a lowercase d. It is case sensitive, but I'll come and check. I'll tell you what, let me show you how you check that. So the Terraform is trying to use a connection. It's trying to use in environments. So if you want to click on environments, hopefully you have one called dev.
I have no environments.
You have no environments. Okay. Let me show you how you would do that. In fact, I'll show you because it's all set up. If you click on create environment, in the environment name, dev with an uppercase D, we'll keep it simple till it's non-production. Down in the bottom, it's going to ask you for an AWS account connection. There is only one option in there. Choose that one. Click the create environment. That's how we link the environments that we're working in into our AWS accounts. Yay! Yeah. Please follow along and we'll check that. Depends on the permissions they've given you when we set up those roles.
If you're looking at the dev environments under code, you won't see any. If you click on
Yes, sorry, it's a little bit confusing. If you're in the code, you've got the dev environments. We actually want the environments in CI/CD.
So I got the error saying I didn't have permissions. But
Okay.
I just went back to environments in my dev environment. Appears that.
Preview.
But it doesn't have an AWS account connection. But it hasn't got an AWS account connection.
Okay, I'll have a look at that afterwards, but yeah, if we had set up the environments properly, and by we, me, I mean me, because I set most of these, I've probably missed a step setting these up. Because we haven't got the CLI, there's no CloudFormation, Terraform for most of these things yet, you have to do it by hand. That's why we use pipelines, because if we do things by hand, we forget steps.
That's good, man. You know, last topic and all that. Got there.
Let's see how my workflow is doing. Let's see if mine's worked. Okay. This is one of the things I say about the dev environments. The idea is to get away from but it works on my machine. Works on my machine. Okay. For those people who have managed to get it to work, if this is running through, I will just show you how we can test. When you get to the stage where your deploy stage has finished, we have hopefully a green tick against it. Find the running Terraform apply. Click the little drop down arrow so we can see the output. There is a lot of output. It's telling us everything that is deployed out there. Down at the bottom, we will have an output section. And what we should have is a variable called API Gateway URL. We want to copy that. If I click in the right place. Let me do this. Okay, so the URL, remember one of the things it warned us about was no authentication on that. So if we ping that URL, we should get a response. It's also telling me the account we are deployed into. I just put a little check in there. We have that developer environment open. That has curling. So, it's just I've changed some files. Stop moaning, yes, I know I've got to open in multiple windows. You could just do a curl of that URL. This is where I find out if it's worked. The API gateway has been called 124 times. So if you remember, I said at the beginning, there's an API gateway for each project. It's got its own Lambda. They're all talking to a single DynamoDB table. Every time you call the API gateway, it increments a field in the DynamoDB table and it returns that message. So even though we're all running our own projects, we get the count back. So that's actually running in our accounts now, or at least mine, because my environment was set up properly. Hopefully some people have got deploys working. Yeah, we've got a couple of nods. Yeah. If you ran that, if anybody wants to take that URL, if you really wanted to copy and paste that, you could try calling that, or you can take it on trust that once you get the deploy, you can see the outputs. Have you tried pinging it? Did you get a response? Yes. Excellent. If you don't like using curl, there's various tools you could try online. I just Googled and found one. You can take, there's one called REST Ninja. Paste the URL in there, click send. You'll see it's giving us the same information, a couple of higher numbers. Obviously, a couple of people have got it working. It tells us it's returned as a status 200 HTTP, so we know it worked. It tells us how long it took. The delays on there are my fault, not AWS. It's just not great code. That's it. So we have gone through, we've taken my example code, we have tested it, we've made sure it works, we've made sure there's no vulnerabilities in there, or if there are, they're all low-level ones, and we deployed it into our AWS account, ran the CodeCatalyst. That's the majority of what CodeCatalyst is about. It's a single environment where we can work. I will just quickly show you a couple of the other things. I mentioned development environments, showed you we can work either in Cloud9 or if we've got a local editor that's supported, we could do that. I mentioned at the beginning, it has ticketing. So if you wanted to run your Kanban boards, you can run it here, you can create tickets, assign them to people. You can see here, it's a Kanban board to do in progress, in review, done, fairly standard board. This will also tie into Jira. So when you click the create issue in here, it will actually create the issue in your Jira board. You can manage it there or in here, whichever you prefer. It's just if you're already got those tools and workflows, you can carry on using them. That's about it for what I wanted to show you today. Hopefully you've seen that CodeCatalyst, it is in preview still, so there are a couple of little things there that might come up occasionally. I will say that for the people with the environment problems, that's my fault, not CodeCatalyst. You can follow along with those labs if you wanted to. You'll have to set up your own environments, point it at your own AWS, but it's there. Try it out, use the free tier. You can try all of these things yourself. Yeah, I think it has the potential to be a really useful tool. As I said at the beginning, it's a real pain for most of us who are working in enterprises. We've got different Git repositories, we've got different pipelines, different ticketing, board management, all of those kind of things. It brings it all together in one space. And that's what AWS said. Remember at the beginning, trying to solve those common pain points. So I hope you enjoyed today. I hope it was useful. I hope it gave you an insight into what we can do with CodeCatalyst. It is evolving, it's going to change. I'll tell you what, the last thing I mentioned, I said we can get to repost. Since I kept saying if the people have got questions, go to repost. It's just repost AWS. It's not just CodeCatalyst, it's everything AWS related. So you can see lots of recent questions in there. People are talking about CloudWatch logs. If you search for CodeCatalyst, you'll get those spaces. If you look really closely, you will see a familiar face in there. Very small familiar face. It is me. As I said, that logs in through the builder IDs. So it's that common ID again that you use. There are quite a few people doing the same thing. They're trying CodeCatalyst out. So other people are finding kind of the gotchas, things that don't work quite as expected. You've got other people in the community who are coming back and answering. I do know the product team are on there, because if you look at it, some of my questions have got answers from the product teams. It says name-AWS. So they are on there, they're active. They do want the feedback. So if you try it out, you find things that don't work, don't just go, oh, go into repost, tell them. They can only improve the product if we let them know where there are problems. That is the end of the workshop for today. thank you very much for bearing with me. I know it was kind of a lot of step throughs. If you do want to go through it yourself, those readmes are there in the GitHub DevOps Playground hands-on with CodeCatalyst, if I remember the URL. But if you go to GitHub DevOps Playground, you'll find it in there. Yeah, hope you enjoyed that. Hope it was useful, and thank you very much for coming along. Excellent. We'll tidy up afterwards. Yeah. That won't show if you went in, because it's only creating an API gateway and a Lambda. It's easy to tidy up, so I say that.
And the question online was, is there a way to use this under AWS Control Tower?
Ooh, that would be an interesting one. I'm not quite sure what they mean in terms of under AWS Control. Do you mean deploying CodeCatalyst through Control Tower? Maybe if you explain a little bit more about what you need, we'll pick that question up later and we'll try and answer it. Yeah, we'll come back to you on that one. As I say, there isn't a great deal of automation yet around CodeCatalyst. The CLI, you can do some things, you can create spaces, you can create projects. It can't do everything yet. So you might be able to link it to Service Catalog, for example, those kind of things. It's not all the way there, it's not fully automated. It would probably struggle with Control Tower if that's how you wanted to deploy. Remember what I said, there's no integration with SSO yet either. So you'd have to think about how you roll out those builder IDs. We had to do it manually, for example, for today. We had to go in and create 40-odd worker IDs, builder IDs. But it'll get there. I'm sure that at some point you will be able to roll out the CodeCatalyst environment through some form of automation.
Have they published their timeline for the roadmap?
Nope. I asked a question around, as I said earlier, about the extensions. What they're going to do is there is a roadmap. They mentioned that things like SSO are on there. They mentioned that at the reInvent. That's not a secret. They're typically, AWS always are fairly cagey about their development roadmaps. It's not CodeCatalyst. But go on, ask them. Go into repost. They can only say, come back soon. Okay, anything else? Any other questions? What do people think of CodeCatalyst? Does it look something that might be useful?
Yeah, I'm thinking of the client that you're currently on, and how the onboarding process involves probably spending a couple of days getting your dev environment sorted out. So yeah. I like the idea of having like a unified dev environment.
And it's not just sorting out the environment. I do know, and it isn't just the client I'm working with, and this is fairly common, that different teams will have different ways of building the environments. You switch to a different team, and it's all different, and you've got to learn again. Mm-hmm. If you've got that dev file, you can roll a standardized thing out. Maybe per team, you could still do that through your repos. Yep. That dev file that I told you about in the repo that defines what it's doing, you can still use those. Or you could be picking that up from an organization-wide repo. So everybody gets the same tool set. Yeah. Flexibility's there.
Can you install extra things on the, I forgot to check at the time, but can you like yum install and
yeah.
Yeah.
So you can stick things on so if you wanted to install. If you remember, through the workflows, we install Terraform through Yum. If you go into the dev environments, you get 16 gigabyte of space, if you remember. Right. It's open to the internet, so if you need to, if you remember when I showed you the dev file, I didn't go into a lot of detail. It just does a pip install of the libraries, so it just goes out to the standard pip repositories, pull down the packages. Right. Yeah, so pretty much everything's possible. If you can do it through the command line, you can probably do it. Okay. If there's nothing else, as I say, thank you very much for coming along. I'll be around for a little while yet. If there are any questions or if you want to talk about it, then yeah, come grab me. But yeah, thanks very much for giving us your time today. And yeah, I hope you get in, give it a try. Find some things, break it to Amazon, but tell them the stuff you like as well. It is to say it's a preview product, it's only been out a couple of months, I think you can see that it does a lot of things. Yeah, I don't work for Amazon just because I've got the t-shirt. It's just one of the goodies from reInvent. Okay, yeah, thanks.